What is a culture war? Most of us have heard that phrase before or maybe even used it ourselves, but we don't actually have a good working definition of what a culture war is. Fortunately, the religious scholar and historian Stephen Prothero does give us a definition of a culture war. He says that it is usually a conservative project, so something started on the right, and generally a grievance of a perceived loss of an old order. And it often begins as maybe some complaint about policy, and then escalates into a sort of panic about a loss of moral footing and a need to get a country back onto a righteous path. And early in 2021, we actually saw a really good example of a culture war emerging during a particular news cycle. You see behind me, it is a headline from the Washington Post that says, "Fox News' latest straw man is made of red meat." Fox News, by the way, being a right-wing news network in the USA. And it was followed a couple of days later by another one from Axios. And that one says, "New culture war, the meat you eat." And then there's the Associated Press, among others, reporting red meat politics. GOP turns culture war into food fight. GOP is an acronym for Grand Old Party, or the Conservative Party in the United States. And I thought that this was particularly fascinating, mostly because I don't think that they were very timely with these headlines. As a matter of fact, I thought that these headlines and this news cycle was about 200 years too late. Because it's not the emergence of a culture war that we were looking at, but rather the continuation of one. And for myself, as a media scholar, an anti-racism advocate, and someone who's vegan, I wanted to interrogate that a little bit further. And what I personally found is that racial violence and animal violence share a startling amount of overlap. And so what I wanted to share with you today are 3 ways that veganism helped to shape my anti-racism advocacy. So let's get into it. The first way that veganism helped to shape my anti-racism is by helping me to contextualize history. One of the first things that I came across was the understanding that a lot of our ideas around race and species are born from a general type of pseudoscience. Polygenesis, in particular, is something that I found really, really fascinating. And if you don't know what polygenesis is, it is a theory of human origin that posits the view that different races were actually formed from different species. So all of the races were different types of animals. And this wasn't a fringe theory. This was actually something, or a style of thought, that had permeated most of our institutions, our cultural institutions, our philosophical, academic, medical institutions across the board. Many people believed in it. People like the French philosopher Voltaire, Christoph Meiners, who was a German ethnographer, and Anders Retzius, who was a Swedish anthropologist. So loads of people all across the European continent. And while polygenesis itself wasn't new, what was new is that many Europeans were using it as a justification for believing themselves to be different from, and in many cases, superior to other species. And it also amounted to a justification for Europeans thinking that they had the capacity to dominate, commodify, and consume other species. And when I say consume other species, I am talking about other species, including humans. And if you were thinking, well, surely, Christopher, you don't mean that Europeans were eating other humans when you're talking about consumption, let me very quickly disabuse you of that notion, because, as a matter of fact, they were. Vincent Woodward actually died in 2008, but his book, The Delectable Negro, was published posthumously by New York University Press in 2014. And in it, he does talk about the metaphorical, psychological, sexual, and very physical consumption of Black people, which is absolutely astonishing to consider. It details so many gruesome accounts, up to and including the accounting of the grisly murder of slave rebellion leader Nat Turner, and what happened to Nat Turner after his death, which, if you're unaware, his fat was rendered down to be used as medicinal grease. It really puts me in mind of when people talk about, like, oh, the importance of using the whole animal, if you will. But I'm sure it's okay because they thanked him for his sacrifice, right? That was real. These are things that happened. In addition to that, non-human animals were used all across North America in order to assert white domination in a variety of ways. In his book, Red Meat Republic, author Joshua Sprecht talks about the cattle-beef complex. He introduces us to that concept. And the cattle-beef complex was contingent upon the genocide of Native American communities, killing millions of Native Americans to clear the way for livestock farming. The cattle-beef complex was also complicit in the doctrine of manifest destiny, which was what a lot of people believed at that time to be the idea of the westward expansion of European settlers, aka colonizers, was not just inevitable, but it was justified by God himself. Which brings me to the second thing that I learned about anti-racism through my veganism, is that the use of animal products holds racial power. There was an article in 2017 on Mic.com written by the journalist Jack Smith. And he announces the headline that milk is the creamy new symbol of white supremacy in Donald Trump's America, with a headline image of a bunch of shirtless white nationalists guzzling milk out of gallon jugs while it's streaming down their chests. Why were they doing that? It's because what we know now is that most of the non-Western world is lactose intolerant. And the population of people who are best able to consume dairy are of Northern European heritage. And so they are using milk as a means to assert their perceived genetic superiority. The consumption and use of animal products holds racial power. There are other examples too. This is an image of the US politician Sarah Palin. Some of you may be familiar with her. If not, she's a former Alaskan governor, and she was a one-time vice presidential candidate. And when she was being interviewed by Fox News for their All-American New Year's Eve celebration, they asked her what her New Year's resolutions were. And Sarah Palin replied that she had 3. Her first resolution was to eat more meat. I know, right? And her second resolution was to make the federal government as irrelevant to our lives as possible. Her third resolution, she said, was to restore America to its exceptionalism. Now, it's really easy to dismiss Sarah Palin's words as a joke. I mean, come on, she starts out by saying she was going to eat more meat. That's funny, right? But jokes, especially in right-wing extremist circles, oftentimes conceal deeper meanings. And so when she says she was going to eat more meat, that acts as a dog whistle to all of the people who were part of her in-group and leads into something that is much more sinister, making the federal government as irrelevant to our lives as possible as Americans, and then ultimately to restore America to its exceptionalism, which is just another way of saying to continue the twin projects of neocolonialism and American imperialism, also known as white supremacy. But maybe you want quantitative data. That would be more convincing. Don't worry, we have that too. This is actually a study that comes from Germany, in which researchers using difference in differences models actually learned that wolf attacks predict far-right voting behavior. Why is that? Because far-right politicians actually exploited the fears and insecurities that people had about wolves attacking livestock and framed that as a threat to the economic livelihoods of livestock farmers. And so swaying thereby those voters toward voting for far-right candidates, which of course also correlates with racism. Once again, the use and consumption of animal products holds racial power. But if that's true, and that it does hold racial power, that brings me to my third point. Really important one. If that holds racial power, rejection of animal products frightens the establishment, and it upsets the racial hierarchy. And we've got examples of that too. In Australia, in 2019, then Prime Minister Scott Morrison was actually criticizing vegan protesters who were protesting against livestock exports. And he called them un-Australian. And in so doing, Scott Morrison was saying the quiet part out loud, right? It's un-Australian to protest these livestock exports. Why was he saying the quiet part out loud, though? Because the three main exports, the animal exports in Australia, are sheep, goats, and cattle. Guess what? None of those animals are actually indigenous to Australia. They were brought over by European settlers. Again, what's that word? That C word? Colonizers. And so when he is talking about who is explicitly Australian, he's talking about white people. Those are the real Australians. And to protest against those livestock exports is un-Australian. The rejection of animal products holds power as well. It destabilizes that racial hierarchy. It threatens white supremacy. Back in my home country of the United States, we've got loads of examples of this. The actress and civil rights icon Cicely Tyson, in what became one of her final interviews before her death at the age of 96, she was talking to a morning show, and she was telling the hosts, Kelly and Ryan, about her history. And she said, which was absolutely stunning, that when she had witnessed the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, it shocked her so much that she became vegetarian. Dick Gregory, a comedian, entrepreneur, and also a civil rights activist himself, he also cited Dr. Martin Luther King. In his 2000 memoir, A Callous on My Soul, he actually said that under Dr. King's leadership, he had come to the conclusion that thou shalt not kill extended past humans into the other than human world, non-human animals as well. He had committed to a complete rejection of animal products and committed to a life of nonviolence. He went completely vegan, not just vegetarian. And who could forget Mother Angela Davis, whom I love, prison abolitionist and author of so many books, one of my personal heroines. When she was asked by Dr. Breeze Harper where animals fit into her sphere of social justice, Angela Davis replied by explaining that animal agriculture conceals so much cruelty. It's criminal that we can actually sit down to eat a piece of chicken and not have to think about where that chicken came from, how that chicken was objectified and fragmented, and the violent life that that chicken had to lead in order to become a commodity that was sitting on our plates. That's what she thought about animal agriculture, and that's why she herself had gone vegan. It's stunning to me because there are so many opportunities to look through 20th century history, and especially throughout the civil rights movement, and find several examples of how the experience of racial trauma had influenced so many people to radically re-examine their own relationships to hierarchies and to hierarchical violence in particular, and realize that one of the most powerful weapons that we have is choosing radical solidarity with others who are not like ourselves. Now, of course, the opposite is also true. For every person who chooses to reject that violence, there are just as many people who choose to participate in even more violence. A lot of Black people who are part of civil rights circles think of Black self-determination, or the right of Black people to self-determination, to just do whatever it is that we want, or to reproduce the types of violence that white supremacy has visited upon us. But why would we want to do that? Why would we want to reproduce that same type of violence? It's unnecessary. It's cruel. It doesn't abolish hierarchies. It demonstrably does not do that. You also see lots of conversations like this one on social media as well. This is a conversation between people that I witness over and over again, comparing veganism to orthorexia, or an eating disorder, in which some foods are pure versus other foods are thought to be impure. And then you see in the reply someone actually saying that, like, oh, veganism is a gateway to white supremacy. Completely absurd. Maybe this would be true if veganism were a diet, but veganism isn't actually a diet. Of course, adopting a plant-based diet can be part of veganism, and indeed it probably is one of the biggest parts of it, because that's the way that most of us interact with other animals every single day. However, veganism itself is an ideology. It is a political movement for animal liberation, not a diet. It is the rejection of the commodity status of other animals, the property status of other animals. Because that was so often used against us as Black people, I recognize that as part of my struggle as well. And it's just absurd to think that veganism is anti-indigenous. It's just as absurd to think that, like, someone would actually use that phrase knowing that people like Angela Davis is vegan. I would absolutely invite these Twitter intellectuals to go and have a conversation with Mother Angela Davis and say, oh, you know what you are? You're anti-indigenous. You know what you do? It's a gateway to white supremacy. That's what that is. Ridiculous. Have that conversation with Angela Davis and then come back to me. It is absurd. I also have to say that it's completely absurd that we can think of veganism as something that's anti-indigenous when I literally just told you that Native American communities were completely massacred in order to make way for cattle farming. That's anti-indigenous. Get out of here. No, your mother is anti-indigenous. That's ridiculous. Also, you would be completely wrong. According to the Washington Post in a 2020 article, Black people are the fastest growing demographic of people in the United States who are adopting a plant-based diet and going vegan. Whether that's for ethical reasons or not, so many people are waking up to the fact that rejecting animal products actually destabilizes that racial hierarchy. It threatens the establishment. It frightens the establishment. That's the power that veganism actually can hold. And so to wrap up, I just wanted to share with you this quote with the Puerto Rican writer, Aurora Levins Morales. She talks about solidarity, or what I like to call radical solidarity. She says solidarity is not a matter of altruism, of just being good. Solidarity, it comes from the deep recognition that, like it or not, my liberation is tied up with that of every other being on this planet. And I'll say that again. My liberation, like it or not, is tied up with that of every other being, not man, not woman, every other being on this planet. And I would really, really love to invite all of you to participate in this particular act of radical solidarity with me. Thank you so much for having me.